Welcome to philosophy, students. This will be Module 1 and we'll consider the historical significance of philosophy and a few terms. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, and that's exactly what philosophy does. It's simply thinking hard about life, what we've learned, and about our place in this world. Philosophy means literally the love of wisdom. However, many are not trained today in hard thinking and they're starved for good ideas. Many people will quickly retreat to pop philosophies and exotic religious practices or even extremist politics, as you see on the news. The difference between a good philosophy of life and the popular alternatives is one of quality, and I hope that's what you gain from this course, a good quality philosophy. This means the quality of your ideas and your understanding and the fact that you don't accept cheap substitutes to the real thing. Now, there are 6 fields of philosophy that we will examine in this course. The first is logic. That means sound thinking and good argumentation or defense of your position. The next is the philosophy of religion. What do you think about God? The study of nature of the divine. Then we will look at reality. That is the study of philosophy known as metaphysics. Epistemology is that field of philosophy that studies knowledge and truth. Ethics would be the field of philosophy that studies good and bad, right and wrong, and the search for the good life. And last but certainly not least is the political philosophy. It's controversial, but this is where we'll study the foundations and nature of our society and the governing state. Now, there are primary features of philosophy. There is reflection, where you step back, listen to yourself and others, try to understand and evaluate what you hear. There's articulation, where you put your ideas in clear, concise, understandable language. There's argument, which does not mean to fight. It simply means to support your ideas with reasons from principles and observations. There is analysis. That's the understanding of an idea by distinguishing and clarifying its components. And lastly, there's synthesis. This is your gathering together of different ideas into a single unified vision. Again, I hope this is what you gain from our course. Now, there are 2 types of knowledge that we will look at in this course. There is empirical knowledge, which is also called a posteriori. This is knowledge that we gain from our 5 senses: seeing, tasting, feeling, hearing, or smelling. Then there is a priori knowledge. This does not come from our 5 natural senses, but it's something that we know to be true. For instance, the statement, bachelors are unmarried. We know the definition of bachelors, and we have that idea. Now, arguments or a defense of what you believe can come together through deduction or induction. These 2 different methods of concluding your statement differ in 2 ways, either by structure or the strength of the conclusion. Deductive is the strongest of the 2. It's a type of logic that goes from a general statement to a specific instance. For instance, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You have a major premise, A equals B, a minor premise, B equals C, and your conclusion then would be A equals C, much like in mathematics. Then there's inductive reasoning that is not quite as strong of a conclusion. This involves using a series of specific cases or examples to come to a general conclusion, but that conclusion is never guaranteed. Now, all arguments are either deductive or inductive. For example, all bats are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded, so all bats are warm-blooded. We start off with the general, which would be all bats. Then we go to the mammals and the specific warm-blooded. When you go from general to more precise, that is deductive. Remember, A equals B, B equals C, thus A equals C. Inductive starts with an individual example, such as Kristen is a law student. And then most law students own laptops, so probably Kristen owns a laptop. But you notice that's not a guarantee. Now, not all logic and even the argumentation is sound. We must look at each critically to examine it. There are some non-truths out there. One is called a paradox. A paradox is self-contradictory or absurd. For example, the statement, there is a barber who shaves everyone in town who does not shave himself. Well, if the barber doesn't shave himself and he lives in town, then he's not really shaving everyone in town. There are also tautologies. These are trivially true statements such as, boys will be boys, or you can't know anything unless you know something. Then there are fallacies. Fallacies are false. There's the ad hominem, which attacks the author and not their argument. There's the ad populum, and that's true just because many people believe it. There's the appeal to authority that claims an argument's right just because someone famous believes it. There's something called begging the question, when your premise and your conclusion basically say the same thing. There's a hasty generalization like Sally. Sally couldn't find any cute clothes in that store, therefore they had no cute clothes. That's not necessarily true. It's just Sally couldn't find anything. Then there are people that just miss the point, such as, pain medication is overly prescribed and dangerous, therefore it should all be illegal. Well, that's not true either. What about the person who has major surgery and needs pain medication? Then there's the straw man. That's when you put forth an opponent's weaker point and destroy that, making that opponent look weaker. And lastly, there's post hoc or false causes. For instance, the person who says that football players make better grades than baseball players. Therefore, football must make you smarter. Well, that's not true either. Now let's talk about Socrates. Socrates was one of our great philosophers, and one of his statements was, strong minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, weak minds discuss people. Socrates had a very interesting life as well. He lived in Athens, Greece, and there's no recorded writings from him personally. What we know about Socrates came from his student Plato. Now, Socrates had a father who was a stonemason and his mother was a midwife. So he comes from moderate wealth at his time, but he lived mostly in poverty. He did serve for a short while in the military, in the infantry, as a foot soldier. And he also had a much gossiped about marriage and possibly several children. But he gave us much in Western philosophy. He gave us the Socratic method of teaching, which is asking questions. And he was even cited by Martin Luther King in the letter from Birmingham jail and by President Benjamin Franklin in his 1791 autobiography. Unfortunately, Socrates was actually put to death by the government of Greece. His crime was called disrespecting of their gods and corrupting the youth, because he was encouraging all of the younger and middle-aged people to question what the government was telling them and to look into this in an analytical way. He was subjected to death by drinking of hemlock, which is a poison. His friends and students arranged for him to escape, but Socrates said no. He wanted to live with integrity in life and in death, so he refused to escape death. Here is another quote from Socrates. He was possibly one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And here is a painting where he is about to drink the hemlock, and some of his students and friends are around and very distraught. Now, Socrates did have a number of students, one of which, the most famous probably, was Plato. Now, Plato founded what was called the Academy later as he became an adult, and that is what is the first institution of higher learning. He is the first Western philosopher whose writings have survived. Remember, Socrates had no writings himself. Most of what we know about Socrates does come from Plato, and he agreed with Pythagoras that mathematics were essential in understanding the world. Aristotle was a student of Plato's. Aristotle was born in Macedonia, and his father was a physician, so he came from moderately to higher wealth. His parents, though, died when he was a teenager, so he moved to Athens, Greece, and he enrolled in Plato's academy. He stayed there for 20 years, and during that time he even tutored Alexander the Great. Now, he does disagree with Plato's ideas in several ways that we'll talk about in later chapters. Plato was a realist and Aristotle was an idealist. Plato believed a priori knowledge was prenatal and Aristotle did not. Later, Aristotle founded his own institution of learning called the Lyceum, and he eventually had to flee from Athens to avoid persecution for having known Alexander the Great. Immanuel Kant is a more modern philosopher, not one of the older ancient philosophers. Here is a quote from him: "We are not rich by what we possess, but by what we can do without." Immanuel Kant was actually Russian. He came from a religious family, and he eventually became a professor of logic and metaphysics. Although he was physically frail, he is known to be a very regimented man. That probably helped him in distinguishing his arguments. And he became increasingly detached from family and friends the older he was. He retired from public life in 1797, but he continued writing. Now let's look at some more key historical figures of philosophy. There is St. Augustine of Hippo. He was an African theologian and a philosopher whose writings influenced Western philosophy. He is said to have written the very first autobiography that we know of. Then there is Copernicus. Copernicus, you may remember, is a mathematician and an astronomer, but he's also a philosopher. His model placed the sun in the middle of the universe with the earth rotating around it. There is René Descartes. Descartes is a French mathematician and also a philosopher. He proposed that it's hard to determine what's real and what's a dream. He also is known for the creation of the Cartesian coordinate system on which we draw graphs in algebra. Diotima influenced Socrates. She was a friend, and with her hierarchy of beauty and experiences, she even proposed that everyone should have children to experience that version of immortality. Pelagius is a contemporary of St. Augustine. He argued that God's grace was only achieved through good works from believers. Now let's review a few things that you'll see at the end of our chapter. Some key terms. Remember, philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. The word convention is a general agreement about some symbols and words. Determinism is the belief that all events are caused and dependent upon other events, but libertarianism is the belief that emphasizes freedom and the ability to choose a free act. Now let's practice some of our philosophy. Question number 1. Is there anything you would willingly die for? Well, after you think about that, let's look at history. Socrates did die of drinking hemlock. He was convicted by the Grecian government for corrupting youth, and he refused Crito's plea to escape. He would rather respect the law. And then, of course, Nathan Hale is the American patriot hanged by the British. How about this question? How are humans different from a cow or an insect? Well, a major difference is that humans are reflective in our minds. We can discuss differences in our purpose of our life, and we are thoughtful and philosophical. How about this? What's most real? The chair you sit in, the molecules that make up the chair, or the sensations that you have of the chair? Reality is not always obvious. What seems evident to our senses can turn out to be an illusion, like a magician. Scientists tell us that a chair is really just an enormous complex of invisible particles, atoms, and molecules, and there are electrons whizzing around in there. But the philosopher says that the chair is not real, but rather it's your sensation of sight and touch. How about this? How would you like to step into a happiness box? This takes a look at what you value. If it's pleasure and contentment, then obviously you ought to get into this box. When you get into this box, you're guaranteed happiness, but if you stay too long in the happiness box, you can never get back out. So if, on the other hand, you think that life's about relationships with people or ambition or doing something, you wouldn't want to stay in that box too long. But then again, if the reason you like to have friends is because you enjoy them for pleasure, then why not just get in the box without the hassle of having people and to work on friendships? After all, isn't that what you really want? Ah, quite the question. Hey, do you believe that it is wrong to take a life under any circumstances? There are two main contexts when this question comes up immediately, and they are controversial. One is the question of abortion, and the other is the age-old quandary of when war is justified. But what the question also provokes is a sense of the nature of morality. Do moral principles hold no matter what? Suppose you had a chance to save an entire city by sacrificing one innocent child, like in the Greek tragedies, in which the warrior Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter to assure victory in the Trojan War. Or suppose God said to you, like he said to Abraham in the biblical account, that he wanted you to take the life of your child to prove your faith. On the other hand, is it right to artificially extend the life of a person who's suffering horribly from an incurable cancer? Is life by itself worth more than anything else under all circumstances? What if we discover that another society has different views from ours when it might be appropriate to take a life? This raises the general question of whether we have the right to impose our morality onto other cultures. How about, is freedom always a good thing? Well, suppose a dictator runs a country smoothly without any problems and people obey and there's no crime, no unemployment, no economic scarcity. How could you convince these people that they're missing out on something? Is freedom necessary for happiness? Should freedom be defended no matter what? How about it, is freedom sometimes harmful? Like people have the freedom to not wear a seatbelt. Does one person's freedom sometimes threaten another? Like the supremacist group who showed up in Charlottesville in 2017 and actually killed a woman during a demonstration. Or possibly that free schizophrenic who's out on the street and could potentially be dangerous. And lastly, do you want to have children? Many people have children for different reasons. Some people have children for terrible reasons. Choosing to have children is one of the most important decisions anyone can ever make, and it will have longer-lasting personal consequences. Diotima implored Socrates to have children just to make life more meaningful and to get a taste of immortality. Well, I hope you see that some of these questions will be a bit deep. Maybe they're about topics you've never thought about. So I encourage you to think hard during this class, articulate what you believe, and give good arguments and defenses for that belief. Study well